Hello. So today we will talk about a couple of very important issues that's facing the USA and the new Trump administration. One of the most difficult things to address is the debt issue. The debt deficit financing has been pretty steady in its growth in the last 5 to 8 years. It's getting worse by the day, and in the next 10 years, it's gonna be a tremendous burden if not addressed right away. So we have this DOGE, Department of Government Efficiency, that's been set up under President Trump's administration, headed by Elon Musk, and for a while they seemed like Vivek Ramaswamy would also be part of that, but he's not in DOGE anymore, I suspect. Anyway, the problem here is this: at over $36 trillion, the US GDP is pretty large, humongous, and the national debt is turning into an unsustainable burden. The trajectory of growth of the debt is pretty bad. The CBO, the Congressional Business Office, in this projection, it says the federal budget deficit is 1.9 trillion, say close to 2 trillion this year, and the Fed debt rises to 118% of the GDP if nothing is done um, by 2035. So economic growth slows and inflation declines over the next 10 years. Both remain moderate after 2026, but the next 2 years growth is an issue, inflation is issue, and then it can become a moderate problem down the road. Now, DOGE is targeting 2 trillion in cut this year, apparently exceeding the total annual discretionary spending by the US government. Now, the deficit amount to 2 trillion in 2024 grows to 2.8 trillion by 2034. Deficits equal 7% of GDP approximately in 2024. It's going to be 6.5% of GDP in 2025 and so on. By 2027, it might drop a bit to 5.5 if things go well. Thereafter, generally it increases faster than the revenues of the country. So by 2034, the adjusted deficit equals 6.9%, so call it 7% of the GDP at the time, significantly more than the 3.7% that deficits have averaged over the last 50 years. Just imagine, we are around 3.7% for about 50 years, but then it's kind of doubled to 6.9% of the GDP. The deficits have grown faster, haven't they? Now, what can you do about it? So, DOGE is trying to cut to a trillion apparently. So, what exactly is the 2 trillion figure? Now we have about $880 billion of the US government spending that goes towards interest payments every year. Let's call it 1 trillion. So national debt, the debt servicing takes about $1 trillion, which means the line of expenditure cannot be reduced without putting the US government at default. You can't keep paying trillion and a half dollars for as interest payments every year. Our defense budget is about $880 billion. So can you imagine the debt servicing being more than the defense spending expenditure? So around 1.46 trillion or 22% of our expenditure is social security, uh, pensions for the Americans over the retirement age. Um, this is called part of the mandatory spending. You can't mess with it. There is going to be a political price to pay for it. So now you can imagine the frantic work being done by DOGE, by Elon Musk, by his teams, by the Trump administration to get a handle on the expenditures in all the various departments to find out what can be cut, find out how much fat can be cut. There's not going to be an easy solution. It's a big challenge. So, Social Security, for example, $1.6 trillion. 1.46 trillion. How much can you cut? How do you cut social security expenditures? It's mandatory. So is Medicare. Now, these other lines of expenditure, the Defense Department, the veterans benefits, all of that. Now, Trump and Musk hopes something will happen when they try to cut some success in cutting expenditure. Musk proposed a $2 trillion cut amount. It's about 30% of the total federal spending, 2 trillions. Discretionary spending is 1.7 trillion. So that includes education, transportation, and a whole bunch of other things. Can they all be cut to reach the 2 trillion target that Musk and Trump want? Are you going to cut all the expenditure, education, transportation, and so on? Not very likely. So what next? So what is a better approach? A 3% gap growth, a 3% cut every year, so is a good approach. For example, if we have a 3% deficit target, what would it require? Massive cuts of anti-poverty programs and middle class tax increases might be necessary if you have to shrink our 7% deficit down to 3% of the GDP every year. Now, that is on the expenditure side. How much do you have to shrink? What are you going to tackle? The middle class taxes or anti poverty programs? What are you going to address to cut down expenditure? Secondly, about growth. How fast the GDP growing? That makes an impact. Lawmakers use an assumption of 3% growth for the GDP now as part of the process. Now, real inflation growth is also an issue. Inflation is going to be 3% approximately. The Fed's trying to get it to 2. Doesn't seem like it's moving much from 3. So let's say it's going to be around 3. And the GDP growth, of course, is going to be 4% to be optimistic. You grow at 4% and you give a 3% of the inflation, you really have 1% growth if you look at it that way. So, not much money that's coming in fresh. Um, not much revenue being collected extra, even if the GDP does grow, to offset the growth in the expenditures already that's looming. So, based on the history, sustained 3% growth for a decade would be unprecedented. But let's assume you're able to grow at 3% GDP a year. And we are able to get down inflation to 2.5-ish percent. So you have a really real terms 0.5% GDP growth probably. Let's think of an example here. If S&P is growing, S&P index 500 is growing at 7% a year, inflation says 4% a year, it eats into your earnings. So a 3% cut in spending is possibly all you can expect in S&P in terms of real revenues generated through investments. So if you hold that analogy, a 4% growth GDP with a 2.5%, what should I say, inflation with the 1.5% in real terms, could possibly make up for some of the revenue deficits. It's going to help you pay some of your, if your expenditures don't increase, you can maybe allocate the 1.5% GDP growth towards paying off your debt. It's not an easy task. So again, what else can you do? You can look at the mandatory expenditures, raise the social security age, the full retirement age from 67 to 70. But there's going to be a riot in the street for retired people. Not easy to do. So other things can be attempted. Maybe Medicare can be cut. Again, it's a holy cow. Those things can't be touched. There's too much political pressure. So, frantic efforts by DOGE to cut expenditures in various departments, to close departments, might save you probably $300 million this year. Going down the road, maybe 600, if you're lucky, $1 trillion every year. Interest rates payments is close to $1 trillion every year on the amount of debt we accumulated. At least what you save by cutting department sizes, expenditure, would probably go towards debt servicing. That's the best case scenario we can hope for in the short term. So it's a tough battle that DOGE and the Trump administration is facing. Several administration wash the hands off it. So let's see what this administration will do.